The whole town warned him not to buy the cabin, and now he finally understands why. A broke, aging veteran in a red and black buffalo plaid jacket came to the frozen mountains of Colorado, looking for silence, not trouble. With only his old pickup and a loyal German shepherd by his side, he bought an abandoned winter cabin no one else wanted, hoping it would be the last place he'd ever have to start over. But when his dog began whining and scratching at a narrow wall deep inside the cabin, he uncovered something that was never meant to be found. Behind the wood was a hidden iron door, and beyond it, a secret sealed beneath the mountain for decades. What lay inside wasn't just dangerous, it was powerful enough to put an entire town at risk and force the veteran to face one final mission he never expected. Before we go deeper into this story, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Winter pressed down on Silverton with a weight that felt almost deliberate, thick snow sealing the streets, and a blade-sharp wind carving through the narrow mountain valley. Frank Miller arrived just before dusk, his old pickup groaning as it climbed the final icy stretch of road above town. He was 72 years old, broad-shouldered, despite the years his posture still carrying the square discipline of a man who had once learned never to slouch under fire. A thick gray beard framed a face cut with deep angles and older scars, the kind that did not need explanation. His eyes were pale blue, steady and watchful eyes that had seen chaos and learned how to remain calm inside it. Over his layered clothes, he wore the same thing he wore every winter. Without fail, a heavy red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket frayed at the cuffs, darkened at the elbows, but warm and familiar like a second skin. Beside him sat Rex, a German shepherd pushing 10 years old, large even for his breed, with a coat of mottled black and ash-gray fur that had begun to silver around the muzzle. Rex's ears stayed upright despite the cold, his amber eyes tracking every tree line, every shadow, his body angled protectively toward Frank without conscious effort. Rex had been with him since a roadside rescue outside Spokane years earlier, back when Frank still slept in his truck and believed loyalty was a temporary thing. The dog had proven him wrong. Silverton itself lay below them, a quiet scatter of snow-buried rooftops and dim lights, a former mining town that winter always seemed to reclaim inch by inch. Frank didn't slow to look. He hadn't come for town life or neighbors or warmth from other people. He'd come because a lawyer with nervous hands and a too-clean office had told him the cabin was his now left behind by his older brother Elias, a man Frank hadn't spoken to in nearly 20 years. Elias had been the stubborn one, the one who stayed in the mountains when everyone else left, the one who believed silence was safer than people. Frank understood that better than he liked to admit. As the truck finally broke through the tree line and the cabin came into view, something tight inside Frank's chest shifted. The structure squatted in a small clearing, half buried by snowdrifts, its roof sagging slightly under decades of storms. The chimney was dark. No tracks led to the door. It looked abandoned but not broken, more like something that had been waiting. Frank cut the engine and sat there a moment listening. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the faint creak of branches rubbing together. No engines. No voices. Just space. Rex hopped down first, landing heavily in the snow, stretching his long back with a soft grunt, before lowering his nose to the ground. He moved slowly, deliberately, circling the cabin, checking the perimeter the way Frank had taught him without ever realizing he'd done so. Frank stepped out, next boots crunching the cold, biting through his gloves. He didn't rush. He never rushed anymore. The front door resisted when he pushed it open, swollen wood protesting, before finally giving way. Inside, dust lifted into the beam of dying daylight. The smell of old pine boards, cold iron, and something faintly medicinal hanging in the air. The place was simple: one main room, a narrow sleeping alcove, a small kitchen corner with an ancient wood stove. No decorations. No softness. Frank approved immediately. He set his duffel down and stood still, letting the silence settle around him. For most of his life, silence had meant danger, the pause before mortars, the breath held before orders. Now it felt different. Now it felt earned. Rex padded inside, nails clicking softly, sniffing every corner, every seam, especially the walls, his tail low but relaxed. Frank watched him with the faintest hint of a smile, the kind that never quite reached his face anymore. He shrugged out of his jacket, hung it on the back of a chair, and began unpacking with methodical precision. That night, he lit the stove, fed it wood, listened to the crackle spread warmth slowly through the cabin. Memories came uninvited, as they always did when the world grew quiet. Tents rattling in desert winds, concrete barracks, faces of men whose names had faded, but whose voices hadn't. War had taught him control, discipline, how to survive. What it hadn't taught him was how to stop surviving. Elias's death had reopened that question. They'd fought years ago over money, over responsibility, over the cabin itself. Frank had left. Elias had stayed. Now the cabin belonged to Frank, and the weight of that felt heavier than any inheritance should. The first night passed without incident, Rex sleeping near the door, ears twitching at every sound, while Frank lay awake on a thin mattress, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the cabin breathe. Morning came pale and cold. Frank brewed coffee on the stove and began planning repairs in his head. He wasn't sentimental about the place. It needed work. He liked that. Work gave his hands something honest to do. As he moved through the cabin, checking beams, boards, and joints, Rex stopped at one interior wall that separated the main room from the narrow alcove. The dog sniffed along its base slower than before, then let out a low, uncertain sound. Not a bark, not a growl. Frank paused. His instincts dulled but not gone stirred. He crossed the room, ran his hand along the wall. The wood felt thicker here, darker, colder. Structurally, it made no sense. Elias had never wasted materials. Frank straightened his jaw, tightening. Something about the wall bothered him, not in a supernatural way, but in the same way a poorly hidden supply cache once had, back when lives depended on noticing what didn't belong. Rex looked up at him, ears forward, eyes intent, waiting. Frank rested a hand on the dog's broad head, feeling the steady warmth there, grounding himself. "We'll check it later," he murmured, more to himself than to Rex. For now, he opened windows, hauled wood-shoveled snow, settling into the rhythm of a man who had spent his life adapting to new terrain. Yet even as the day wore on, his thoughts kept drifting back to that wall, to Elias, to the years of silence between them. Frank told himself it was nothing. Cabins had quirks. Mountains had history. Still, as night fell again over Silverton, and the wind rose rattling the windows, the sense that he wasn't as alone as he'd thought settled quietly into his bones. Whatever Elias had left behind wasn't just a cabin. It was a question. And Frank Miller had never been very good at walking away from unanswered ones. The second morning in the cabin broke without ceremony, a dull gray light seeping through the frost-laced windows, as snow whispered steadily against the roof, each flake adding weight to the silence that Frank Miller was slowly learning to live inside. He rose before dawn, joints stiff but obedient, the kind of stiffness earned over decades rather than years, and fed the wood stove with the practiced economy of a man who had learned to ration heat the way others rationed hope. Rex lifted his head from his spot near the door, amber eyes blinking once before settling back into watchful awareness, his breathing slow and even, the calm of a guardian who never fully sleeps. Frank moved through the cabin, deliberately testing floorboards with the edge of his boot, noting the places where the wood complained more loudly, committing each sound to memory. He had learned long ago that structures, like people, always spoke before they failed. The cabin smelled different now that it had been warmed for a full night, the sharp cold giving way to the deeper scent of old pine soaked with decades of smoke, sweat, and solitude. Frank brewed coffee strong enough to bite, drank it standing by the window, and watched the tree line sway as the wind threaded through the branches like a restless hand. He told himself this was good, this quiet, this isolation. It was what he had come for. Work followed coffee as it always had. Frank pulled on his red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, the weight of it familiar and grounding, and set about clearing the cabin properly. He moved furniture aside, dragged the sagging sofa closer to the stove, swept dust and grit into neat piles, his motions steady, economical, revealing a discipline shaped not by comfort, but by necessity. Rex followed him room to room, nose low tail neutral, performing his own inspection with a seriousness that bordered on solemn. It was mid-morning when the dog slowed near the interior wall again, the same narrow partition separating the main living space from the cramped alcove. Rex pressed his nose to the base of the wall, inhaled deeply, then shifted his weight nails, scraping softly against the wood. A low sound vibrated in his chest, not quite a growl, more an expression of unease that Frank recognized immediately. He stopped what he was doing and watched the dog carefully. Rex was not skittish. He had walked calmly through thunderstorms, gunfire echoes during hunting season, even the chaos of roadside accidents without losing composure. This reaction was different. Frank knelt, running his hand along the wall where Rex lingered. The boards here were darker, the grain tighter, the surface colder to the touch. He rapped his knuckles lightly against it and frowned. The sound was wrong, not hollow, not solid, but muffled, like knocking against something that didn't want to answer. Frank straightened slowly, the faint prickle of old instincts crawling up his spine. He had felt this before years ago, standing in half-destroyed buildings overseas, when something about a room didn't align with the map in his head. Back then, ignoring that feeling had gotten men killed. He fetched his pry bar from the truck and returned inside, pausing only long enough to rest a hand briefly on Rex's neck, feeling the steady muscle beneath the thick fur. "Easy," he murmured, voice low, calm. He wasn't afraid, not yet, but he was alert. He began with the intention of practical renovation, telling himself the wall needed to come down anyway to open the space and improve airflow. The first board resisted, then came free, with a dry crack, dust spilling out in a fine cloud that caught the pale winter light. Frank worked methodically, board by board, sweat forming along his hairline, despite the cold, his shoulders burning in a way that reminded him he was still alive, still capable. As the partition thinned, the alcove behind it looked smaller, almost claustrophobic, like a space someone had intentionally closed themselves into. Rex retreated a few steps, watching from near the door, ears forward, his body tense but controlled. Halfway through the job, Frank paused, wiping his hands on his jeans, studying what remained. One section of wall stood apart from the rest, a vertical strip about 3 feet wide, extending from floor to ceiling, backed by wood that was not only darker, but older, reinforced with nails that didn't match the others. He frowned deeply now. Elias had been careful, meticulous even. This wasn't careless craftsmanship. This was deliberate. Frank tapped the hammer against it again, harder this time. The sound came back dull and heavy, like striking a body instead of bone. Rex let out another low sound, closer now, and the hair along his spine lifted slightly, catching the light. Frank felt a tightening in his chest, a mixture of irritation and something colder. He thought of his brother, of the man who had chosen this mountain over people's secrecy, over reconciliation. "What did you do up here?" Frank muttered, not angrily, but with a weary curiosity. He worked the pry bar into the seam, The wood split suddenly sharp and loud, and the top half of the board tore away, swinging inward. Frank froze. Behind the wood was metal. Not wiring, not pipe. Metal. Dark, rough, and cold, its surface scarred by age. Rex backed away a step, then stopped, his body rigid, nose working the air, as if reading something invisible. Frank's pulse quickened, but his hands remained steady. He cleared more debris, revealing the unmistakable outline of a rectangular iron panel, its edges pressed tight against the studs. A handle emerged near the center, thick and corroded, and below it the remnant of an old padlock, its shackle long since cut clean through. This was no reinforcement. It was a door. The realization settled over Frank slowly, heavily. Cabins like this did not have iron doors hidden behind interior walls. Not in the 1920s. Not ever. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the cabin creak, to the wind outside, to the low warning sound rumbling in Rex's chest. He did not touch the handle yet. Instead, he stepped back, assessing the way he had learned to assess rooms that might explode, corridors that might collapse. He noticed the way the floor around the door was more worn, the faint scuff marks, half hidden by dust, evidence that this door had been used. Recently was unlikely, but not never. Frank's jaw tightened. He felt the old weight settle into his shoulders, the familiar responsibility that came with knowing something was wrong, and that turning away wouldn't make it less so. He crouched and examined the hinges, rusted, but intact, thick enough to hold against force. Whoever built this hadn't been improvising. Rex moved closer now, standing at Frank's side, and his presence solid and grounding. Frank reached out and rested his hand briefly on the dog's broad back, fingers sinking into warm fur. "We're not opening it today," he said quietly, more promise than decision. The day had already changed. He could feel it. He covered the exposed metal with a tarp, secured it loosely, and stepped back, his mind already turning through possibilities, histories, consequences. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent and patient, burying tracks and secrets alike. Frank stood in the middle of the cabin, listening to the wind, and understood that whatever Elias had hidden here had waited a long time to be found, and now that it had been seen, it would not allow itself to be forgotten again. The iron door dominated the space once the last fragments of wood were cleared away, its presence heavy and undeniable, as if the cabin itself had been built merely to disguise it. Frank Miller stood still for a long moment, the pry bar hanging loosely in his hand, studying the door, the way he once studied unfamiliar terrain, without panic, without haste, but with an instinct sharpened by consequences. The metal was dark and deeply scarred, layered with rust that bloomed like old wounds across its surface. It ran from floor to ceiling, wedged so tightly between the studs that it looked poured into the cabin rather than installed. The handle was thick iron, curved outward, and worn smooth in places where hands had gripped it repeatedly over the years. Below it, the broken remains of a padlock dangled uselessly, its shackle cut clean through with a precision that suggested tools, not desperation. Rex stood several feet back, weight shifted low, ears flattened slightly, his tail stiff but not tucked, every muscle in his aging body coiled and ready. The dog's low growl vibrated through the room, not loud, not aggressive, but unmistakably serious, the sound he reserved for things that did not belong in the world as he understood it. Frank felt the echo of that sound inside his own chest. He stepped closer, boots crunching softly on debris, and placed his palm flat against the iron. The cold bit through his glove, instantly sharp and invasive, and beneath it he felt faint ridges carved into the metal, lines and shallow grooves, arranged in a pattern that no longer meant anything obvious, but had once served a purpose. His mind supplied unwanted images, sealed doors in concrete bunkers, warning markings half sanded away, spaces meant to contain rather than protect. Jesus. Elias, he muttered, his voice rough but controlled. He tried the handle, carefully testing rather than pulling. At first it resisted, completely unmoving, as if fused to the frame. Then, with a slow, reluctant sound, like the groan of a mountain settling under its own weight, something shifted. Rust flaked down onto the floor. The door moved, barely, the seam widening by a fraction of an inch. Air pushed out from the darkness behind it, cold and stale, carrying a smell that made Frank's stomach tighten. Not rot, not mold, but the sterile metallic tang of old machinery layered with something chemical and faintly bitter. Rex took a step back, lips curling slightly as the growl deepened, a clear warning now. Frank paused, heart thudding steadily, not with fear, but with recognition. He had smelled this before, decades earlier, in places the government pretended did not exist. He tightened his grip and pulled again. The hinges protested loudly, a grinding shriek that vibrated through the walls and into his bones. Dust rained down from the ceiling beams. Outside, somewhere in the trees, birds erupted into flight, startled by the sound. The door opened far enough to reveal a narrow corridor. Beyond its walls poured concrete, its floor sloping gently downward into the mountain. Pipes ran along one side, thick and wrapped in crumbling insulation, while cables disappeared into darkness like roots burrowing deeper into stone. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, several yards in its glass, clouded with dust unlit. The corridor was not wide enough for comfort, not narrow enough to feel accidental. It was deliberate utilitarian, built for function, not habitation. Frank stood at the threshold, one hand still on the iron, the other resting unconsciously against the pocket where his old service knife lived. Rex moved closer, pressing against Frank's leg, not retreating, but not eager either, his body, rigid eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. "Easy," Frank murmured again, though his own nerves hummed beneath the word. He took a flashlight from the workbench and swept the beam cautiously down the corridor. The light caught on moisture along the concrete, glinting faintly, and on rusted brackets bolted into the walls at regular intervals. Nothing moved. The silence beyond the door felt different from the silence of the cabin, thicker, more intentional, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. Frank stepped inside, just one pace, boots crossing the threshold. The temperature dropped immediately, cold, seeping through his soles, crawling up his legs. The smell intensified. Rex followed reluctantly, but loyally, positioning himself slightly behind and to the side, exactly where Frank had once taught him during training exercises long forgotten by everyone else. They advanced slowly, every step measured. The corridor ended sooner than Frank expected, terminating at another door, this one steel and heavier than the first, set directly into the rock face. There was no handle, only a circular metal plate at chest height, polished smooth by countless touches. Frank stared at it, pulse quickening now despite himself. He reached out and placed his palm against the plate. To his surprise, it was warm, not hot, but unmistakably warmer than the surrounding stone. The plate clicked softly beneath his hand, a precise mechanical sound that sent a chill down his spine. A second click followed, deeper, slower, and then the door slid sideways into the wall, with a low, grinding hum revealing a chamber beyond. Warmer air spilled out, stale and heavy smelling of oil and long-slept machinery. Rex growled again, but did not pull away. Inside the chamber, the flashlight beam revealed shelves bolted to the walls, stacked with rusted tools and metal boxes behind fogged glass. On the far wall stood a massive steel cylinder embedded directly into the mountain cables, feeding into it, gauges clustered around its surface like blind eyes. Frank approached slowly, dread settling in his gut with every step. A brass plate was affixed above the cylinder, its lettering faded but legible. He read it once, then again, the words sinking in with horrifying clarity. Subsurface Pressure Containment Unit. Experimental Installation. Frank's mouth went dry. He swept the light downward and saw a thin line of moisture creeping along a weld at the base of the cylinder, one drop forming, then falling lost in the shadows below. His instincts screamed now loud and insistent. This was not a forgotten shelter. This was not a bunker meant to protect. It was a containment system, old and failing, buried beneath a mountain that now supported a town below. Elias had not been hiding a secret for privacy. He had been guarding a threat. Frank backed away slowly, heart pounding, one hand reaching down to steady Rex, who remained glued to his side, despite every instinct telling him to flee. Frank snapped photos of the plate, the leak, the gauges, his hands steady even as his mind raced. He did not attempt to touch anything else. This was beyond improvisation, beyond repair. This was the kind of problem that destroyed landscapes and lives if mishandled. They retreated the way they had come, the doors sealing behind them with heavy finality, the corridor swallowing the light once more. Back in the cabin, Frank leaned against the wall, breath coming harder now, the weight of what he had seen pressing down on him. Outside, the wind howled across the ridge, indifferent and relentless. Frank knew with the same certainty he had once known incoming fire that staying silent was no longer an option. Whatever Elias had held back all those years was awake now, and it was leaking. Frank Miller did not sleep that night, not really. After sealing the iron door as best he could and clearing the cabin of any immediate danger, he sat at the small wooden table with his jacket still on the red and black buffalo plaid, wrapped around him like armor, listening to the mountain work through the dark hours. The wind scraped along the roof. Snow slid in slow sheets from the eaves. Beneath it all, his mind replayed the image of the steel cylinder again and again, the thin line of moisture glistening along the weld, the quiet persistence of pressure that did not care about age or secrecy. Frank had spent his life learning the difference between problems that could be handled with steady hands and problems that would kill you if you pretended they were smaller than they were. This was the second kind. By dawn, his decision was already made, even if he had not yet admitted it out loud. He dressed methodically, movements stiff but precise, boots laced tight, jacket buttoned against the cold. Rex watched him from near the door, head tilted slightly, ears attentive, his gray-dark coat catching the dim morning light. The dog sensed the change in Frank's posture, the subtle tightening that meant something serious lay ahead. They returned to the corridor together, the iron door opening, with the same reluctant groan, the stale metallic air washing over them, like a warning they had already accepted. Frank moved faster this time, flashlight beam, steady eyes sharp. In the chamber, he examined the installation with the trained efficiency of a former combat engineer, cataloging what he saw without touching anything unnecessary. The gauges were old but intact, their needles trembling faintly, not dead, just tired. The steel cylinder was massive, thicker than anything built for comfort, bolted directly into the mountain, as if the rock itself had been conscripted into service. The brass plate identifying the unit caught the light again, the words, "Experimental Program," standing out with bitter clarity. Frank crouched near the base, careful not to disturb the growing bead of moisture, and photographed the weld from multiple angles, adjusting the light to capture the faint vapor curling upward. He knew what water under pressure could do when given time. He knew what rock did when it shifted, and he knew that Elias, stubborn and solitary as he had been, would never have hidden something like this, unless he believed it was the only way to keep it contained. Frank straightened slowly, joints protesting, and scanned the chamber one last time. He did not look for switches. He did not test valves. That temptation had killed smarter men than him. Rex stood close, to body tense but silent, his loyalty manifesting not in bravado but in restraint. "We're done here," Frank said quietly, the words steady and final. They retreated again, sealing the doors behind them, the mountains swallowing the truth with deceptive ease. Back in the cabin, Frank wasted no time. He grabbed his keys, his phone, and the small folder of paperwork he had brought from town, his hands moving with the certainty of a man who had learned that hesitation was sometimes the most dangerous action of all. The drive down the mountain was treacherous snow thickening the road, narrowing into a ribbon of ice and shadow. Frank kept both hands on the wheel, shoulders squared, eyes forward. Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, unnaturally still, his gaze fixed ahead as if memorizing the way out. The switchbacks felt tighter, the drop-off steeper, and for the first time since arriving, Frank felt the mountain's scale pressing against him, immense and indifferent. At a turnout halfway down, his phone flickered to life with a single bar of signal. He pulled over, engine idling, breath fogging the cab. For a moment, he stared at the screen, thumb hovering. Calling it in meant questions. It meant attention. It meant the end of whatever quiet Elias had preserved for decades. Frank exhaled slowly and dialed 112. The operator's voice was calm, professional, a woman with a slight rasp that suggested long hours and little patience for nonsense. Frank explained carefully, choosing his words with the same discipline he had once used in reports that decided whether bridges stood or fell. He described the location, the hidden corridor, the containment unit, the leak. There was a pause, brief but telling, and when the operator spoke again, her tone had shifted, sharpened. She told him to leave the area immediately, to stay off the mountain, to wait for instructions. Frank acknowledged without argument. He did not hang up until she told him to. By the time he reached Silverton, the sky had darkened again, snow falling harder now, the town wrapped in an uneasy quiet. He parked near the old cafe on Green Street, the one with fogged windows and a hand-painted sign promising hot coffee and stronger opinions. Rex stayed close as Frank paced the cold, biting through his gloves, his mind replaying contingencies he could no longer control. It was less than an hour before the first trucks arrived, lights flashing silently through the snow marked with symbols Frank recognized but had hoped never to see again: geological survey insignias, emergency response units, heavy equipment meant for problems buried deep. From one of the trucks stepped a woman who immediately commanded attention, not through volume but through presence. She introduced herself as Dr. Helen Ward, a field engineer specializing in subsurface containment failures. She was in her late 40s, tall and lean, with weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors, and steel-gray hair pulled back into a tight braid beneath her helmet. Her face was angular, eyes sharp behind protective glasses, and when she listened, she did so without interrupting, without skepticism. Frank explained again, answering her questions with clipped precision. Helen did not doubt him. She did not minimize the risk. She simply nodded, already issuing instructions to her team, her voice steady, authoritative. "You did the right thing," she told him quietly, meeting his gaze without flinching. Frank absorbed the words without reaction, though something inside him loosened slightly. He watched as the convoy prepared to move up the mountain, heavy tires chewing through snow, men and women moving with practiced efficiency. He was not invited to join them. No one suggested he should. Frank sat on the tailgate of his truck, Rex's head resting heavily against his thigh, and stared at the dark silhouette of the ridge above town. The mountain loomed there, silent, unchanged, as if nothing beneath it had shifted at all. He thought of Elias then, of the years his brother had spent alone with that knowledge, maintaining a secret that no one thanked him for. Frank understood that kind of burden. He had carried different ones, but the weight felt familiar. Snow continued to fall, erasing tracks, smoothing the world into deceptive calm. Frank stayed where he was until the last truck disappeared up the road, until the lights vanished into the trees. Only then did he climb back into the cab, Rex settling beside him, and wait, knowing that whatever came next would be out of his hands, but not out of his responsibility. The mountain changed without announcing it, the way real danger always did not, with noise but with absence. The road above Silverton closed quietly under temporary barriers and official notices, and within a day, the ridge that had watched over the town for generations became a restricted zone guarded by men and women in insulated jackets and hard helmets, who spoke in measured tones and carried clipboards heavier than they looked. Frank Miller watched it happen from a distance at first, standing beside his truck, with Rex pressed against his leg, feeling oddly invisible now that the truth no longer belonged to him alone. The emergency crews moved with practiced coordination, drilling rigs hauled up through snow-choked switchbacks, cables snaking across rock like veins, the mountain pierced carefully, respectfully, as though everyone involved understood they were operating on something alive. Frank was interviewed once more briefly by officials who asked precise questions and took careful notes, their faces serious but not suspicious. He gave them what they needed and nothing more. After that, he was told to wait. Waiting, he discovered, was harder than action. The weeks stretched into months, winter tightening its grip on Silverton, the town adapting to detours and closures with the stubborn patience mountain communities perfected out of necessity. Frank stayed in town during that time, renting a small room above the hardware store owned by a man named Bill Carter, a stocky, middle-aged local with a thick mustache and perpetually reddened cheeks, who spoke little but nodded often, his manner shaped by decades of cold mornings and heavier secrets he never asked about. Bill didn't pry. He simply made sure Frank had a key, a working heater, and a place where Rex was welcome. Frank spent his days helping where he could, shoveling snow for elderly neighbors, repairing fences, fixing doors that winter had warped out of true. His hands stayed busy, his mind restless. At night, he dreamed of steel doors and ticking gauges of pressure building in places no one could see. Rex aged visibly during those months, his muzzle whitening further, his movements slower but no less determined. He stayed close to Frank, sleeping lightly, ears twitching at every unfamiliar sound, his loyalty now less about vigilance and more about presence. When the call finally came, it was from Dr. Helen Ward. She met Frank outside the cafe where it had all begun, her braid dusted with snow, her eyes tired but satisfied. She told him the containment unit had been stabilized. The pressure vented through controlled channels drilled deeper into the mountain. The old steel reinforced with modern composite fill and sealed behind layers of concrete and steel thicker than anything built in the last century. "It's as safe as geology allows," she said, her voice steady, honest. Frank nodded, absorbing the words without celebration. He didn't ask for details. He understood enough. A quiet disaster had been undone by preparation and restraint rather than heroics, and that suited him fine. He returned to the cabin a week later, driving slowly the mountain road, familiar now in a way it hadn't been before. The barriers were gone, the signs removed. The ridge looked unchanged, snow-draped and indifferent, the secret buried again, this time with intention rather than denial. Inside the cabin, the wall had been rebuilt seamlessly, new wood fitted cleanly against old, the iron door gone replaced by welded steel plates, hidden deep within reinforced concrete. Frank ran his hand along the finished surface, feeling nothing out of place, and felt a surprising swell of relief. The danger was gone. the burden no longer his alone. That first night back, he sat on the porch with a mug of tea, cradled between his hands, the steam rising in pale threads against the dark. Rex lay at his feet, stretched out, his breathing slow and content, tail thumping once when Frank reached down to scratch behind his ears. The forest resumed its ordinary sounds, the distant knock of a woodpecker, the sigh of wind through pine needles, snow melting in thin, patient drips from the eaves. Frank watched the stars emerge one by one, brighter here than anywhere he'd lived before, and felt something inside him finally loosen. He thought of Elias then, of the years his brother had spent alone with that responsibility, guarding a mountain that would never thank him. Frank understood now why Elias had stayed, why he had chosen silence over comfort, vigilance over peace. It wasn't penance, it was duty. And for the first time in his long, restless life, Frank felt himself step fully into that understanding. He wasn't here to disappear. He was here to remain. The mountains stood quiet around him, not as a threat, not as a secret, but as a presence that had been earned. Frank took a slow breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and smiled faintly into the dark, knowing that some battles ended, not with recognition, but with the simple, enduring act of not turning away. At the end of this story, there is a quiet reminder that some miracles don't arrive with thunder or fire. They arrive through ordinary people who choose not to turn away. Perhaps God doesn't always stop danger with a miracle in the sky, but places watchful hearts exactly where they're needed. A tired veteran, a loyal dog, a hidden warning behind a wall. What looks like coincidence may be grace moving silently through everyday life. In our own lives, we may never face a mountain hiding an old secret, but we all face moments where something feels off, moments where we're called to pay attention, to act with courage, honesty, and responsibility. Those small choices, checking one more time, speaking up when it's uncomfortable, protecting others even when no one is watching, may be how God works through us. If this story touched you, take a moment to share it with someone who might need encouragement today. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what this story reminded you of in your own life. And if you believe that even quiet faith and unseen courage matter, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories like this. May God bless every person watching, protect your homes, guide your decisions, and place you exactly where you're needed, sometimes not for recognition, but for a purpose far greater than you can see.